Welcome everybody, and thank you for taking the time and trouble to come today, and thank you for bearing with us while we've had our technical difficulties this morning. We'll be seeing a short presentation from Nathan Martins of Kent Trading Standards, and we'll also have some words of advice from Richard Bond from the DIT this morning, and then we'll be opening the floor to questions. In terms of housekeeping of how we're going to run the meeting, you'll see that we've got you all on mute. That's to make sure that the presentations are of the best quality and we remove all the feedback. If you're not familiar with Zoom, if you move your mouse towards the bottom of the screen, you'll see a taskbar come up with various options on it, one of which is the chat function right in the middle. This will open a chat window on the right hand side of your screen, and we would ask you that if you have any questions, if you can open the chat and drop them in there, and we will put those to the presenters as we go along. We've also, in the headline of that chat, added all of the key contacts for today. So for myself at Produced in Kent, for Trading Standards, for the DIT, HMRC's import and export line, and the Medway Growth Hub business advice line. So all of those will stay in there for the period of the meeting, and as we've already alluded to, we are recording today's meeting so that it can be made available to anybody who was unable to attend, or if you do need to drop out at 2 o'clock at the original finish time, then you can always catch up with what you've missed after the event. I can't see anyone else in the waiting room at the moment, so I think we'll start the meeting. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Nathan.
Thank you very much, Jill. Hello, everybody. My name is Nathan Martin. I'm the Principal Trading Standards Officer for Commercial and Food Services at Kent County Council Trading Standards. And I'm part of a team which is separate from enforcement and dedicated to working with businesses to help you get things right before you experience problems. Now, Jill's asked me to talk to you a little bit about the changes that are going to come in for food legislation that you're going to have to comply with from the 1st of January. Now, I'm fully aware that there's a lot of confusion around this, a lot of it stemming from the fact that the government has delayed. And unfortunately, a lot of businesses, well, understandably, have used that as a reason to delay their own preparations. What we're looking at the moment is about 50% of all UK businesses haven't made any preparations for Brexit. Now, while there are some things that are still unclear, we do at least know what preparations you're going to have to make with regards to food legislation. We know for about 18 months or so when it started to look more and more like a no deal scenario was more likely. So on that basis, I can at least run you through the things that we know you're going to have to do if we end up in a no deal. So I'm going to share my screen so you will see my PowerPoint presentation. If you have questions as we go along, stick them down in chat, and each of the presentation pages are numbered. So put down the page number as well, just to make it easier for me to find it afterwards. Okay. So just to recap on the situation as it stands, over the last couple of years, the government has passed UK versions of all EU legislation, hopefully to minimise the disruption as far as possible. So most of the rules that you've been following so far are going to stay exactly the same. Now, UK enforcement agencies have been told that they're going to take a very lenient stance on enforcement of any goods that you bring into the UK, and that is going to be the case until July this year. But unfortunately, the EU have indicated that the laws will be strictly enforced at the border from the 1st of January. So the changes that have to be made to sending goods to the EU have to be made for day one. So what if you don't comply then? Well, the real consequences of not complying from day one are pretty simple. Your goods are going to be stopped at the border and refused entry to the EU. That's going to cost you money, sometimes more than the value of the goods themselves. Those costs will include detention and examination, and my research shows that can be up to £1,250 per container, with up to £250 a day in storage costs. If for any reason the examination is delayed, you've got the cost of fixing the problem, reworking, relabeling, etc. If it can't be fixed, then you've got the loss of the goods and you have to pay for destruction of them. And then lastly, potential loss of trading partners because you're in breach for non-delivery, and that's going to hurt you both financially and reputationally. So my advice then is don't wait for January 1st when it's too late and it's already cost you money. Prepare now. Now, these are the new requirements that you're going to have to comply with on day one. I'm going to run through the details of each. So firstly, then we have the name and address. Now, the labeling of all pre-packed food has to include the name and address of the food business operator, that's the FBO, who's responsible for that food. So, i.e., is legally responsible for ensuring it's compliant, and then who becomes legally liable if it's not compliant. Now, up until now, that's been you guys, because we've been part of the EU. Now, while we left the EU almost a year ago, we've been treated as though we're still members during transition. But from the 1st of January, we are a third country and we're going to be treated that way. Now, the legislation says that where the FBO is not established in the Union, i.e. is from a third country, then it's the importer into the EU who is responsible for those goods. So that, of course, means that it's the importer's name and address details that have to appear on your product. It's the importer who's responsible for the compliance of your goods, and it's the importer who is legally liable if your goods are not compliant. Now, by allowing you to put their name and address on the product, they're taking on a significant responsibility, and it's unlikely they're going to do that lightly. You're going to need to negotiate some sort of formal agreement with them, and time is running out, so you need to start doing that now. Now, I've got no doubt that many of you would rather your products had your own details on them, and we'll be looking at ways to achieve that. So I want to address the wording of the legislation, which is established in the Union. Now, what this means is that the business in question is actively trading from and has an element of their operation located in one of the 27 member states of the EU. Now, this is a working definition because established in the EU isn't defined in the legislation. However, when we look at the body of argument that's put up around food law and other European legislation that uses the same language, we see a number of factors that are key in deciding whether the business is established in the EU. So, where are the decisions made? Where is the infrastructure located? And where does central administration take place for the business? Now, what this means is that setting up a PO box, mail forwarding address, telephone answering service, etc. in the EU is not enough. If you want to be established in the EU, then some aspect, although not necessarily all, of your business must be based in and operating from the EU. And yes, that includes Ireland. Now, ultimately, if you're not willing or able to move some of your business abroad, then someone else's details are going to have to appear on your product, although yours can appear as well. Now, some of you may have read the Gov.uk guidance on establishment in the EU, which suggests that it may be as simple as having a registered office address in the EU. I just wanted to clarify that this is establishment in the EU for customs purposes. It is not relevant to establishment in the EU for the purposes of EU food legislation. So just to clarify then, each load of goods that you send to the EU is a new import into the EU, regardless of whether that product line itself has been imported into the EU previously. As each load is an import, each of your customers is an importer. So if your business model is that you sell your goods directly to 10 businesses within the EU, then each of those businesses is an importer. You'll have to have agreements in place with each. And when you send your goods to them, their details will need to appear on the product. Now, your responsibility is to make sure the goods are compliant when you send them to the EU. Once they're in the EU, they're no longer your responsibility and they can be sold freely around the Union. Now, if your business model is that you sell goods in bulk to a single EU business who then sells them on into other EU member states, then your duty is discharged after you have delivered to your customer. If they then sell the goods on, they are responsible for ensuring that the product is correctly labelled. Now, that's obviously much simpler at your end, and if you think you'd struggle otherwise, you might want to consider whether this model would be good for your business. Moving on to correct languages then. Now, when you export your pre-packed goods to the EU, the food information has to be clear, accurate, and easy to understand. The major component of which is that they need to be labelled in the community language where they're first placed on the community market. That is, the first EU country where they're available for supply to consumers or other businesses. Now, it's important to understand when goods are placed on the community market because transit through a member state is not placing on the market. So if we look at the example I presented here, a UK business has sold their finished pre-packed goods to a German retailer based in Hamburg. The goods are placed on a lorry in Kent, which takes the ferry from Dover to Calais, then drives from Calais to Hamburg, where the goods are delivered to the new owner. Now, despite the fact that the goods are physically located in France when they enter the EU, they're not available for supply at that point, so they're not on the market. They become available for supply once they're in the hands of the retailer, so they're placed on the market when delivered to him in Hamburg. As such, the goods have to be labelled in German. Now, if you've assumed that your goods are being placed on the market in French because that's where they've landed, and then you have labelled them in French, those goods will either be detained or refused entry. Now, you might be considering that you'll just make agreements with your customers that they relabel in the local language after receiving the goods. Unfortunately, they have to be compliant at the time of transport, or if you don't do it, you can expect them to be refused entry. Now, both name and address and community language are very quick and easy checks to make. It's going to Germany. Is it labelled in German? No, then refuse entry. As such, it is vital that you get this stuff right because it will be picked up on. Now, you're free to label the goods in multiple languages, including English, but they have to be in addition to the one where the goods are placed on the market, and you can't have so much information on that label that it's no longer clear, accurate, and easy to understand. As before, the obligation is only for the first placing, so if the goods are sold on once within the EU, you've got no further responsibility. Origin marking then. So from the 1st of January 2021, UK food can't be declared as of EU origin. Not all food is going to be affected, as origin labelling isn't normally mandatory unless consumers would be misled as to the origin of the product without it. As such, most products are not labelled with their origin. Now, products can mislead as to their origin in a number of ways, so you're going to need to be careful that the presentation of your product doesn't inadvertently mislead people, which would then, of course, trigger the requirement for origin labelling. You have to pay particular attention to a number of things. Firstly, the words and phrases that you use, so statements like Belgian chocolate, French patisserie, Italian pasta sauce, they all give the impression that the goods actually come from those countries, so they shouldn't be used unless they're accurate, i.e. the product actually is Belgian chocolate. Words like style and inspired, etc., can't be used to justify those statements. Now, where a product is from the EU or it contains ingredients from the EU, you can state as much in the description, but you have to clearly state on the labelling that it was manufactured in the UK. So, for example, Belgian chocolate chunk brownie, manufactured in the UK using Belgian chocolate. Now, that qualifying statement doesn't have to be in the name of the food, it just has to be on the label. So second thing then to look out for is use of colours. Now, the colours used on the packaging can mislead as to the origin, especially the colours of national flags, which give the appearance the product is from that country. So, for example, a pizza box in the colours of the Italian flag. And then lastly, images, shapes, symbols, etc. Using the image or the shape of something associated with a particular region or country can mislead us to the origin. So, for example, maps and flags like the St. George's Cross, national landmarks like the Leaning Tower or the Eiffel Tower, and national birds and animals like kiwi bird, Welsh dragon, etc. Now, there are some products that do have mandatory origin requirements, and I've included some examples in this slide. They'll typically need to be described as non-EU or UK from the 1st of January. Some goods, like blended oils, do need specific statements, and if your goods are affected, you should either check the legislation to see what needs to be on there or speak to your local trading standards. So, to make sure your goods are compliant with origin, you need to remove any reference to EU origin, ensure the presentation of the product isn't misleading, correct any mandatory origin declarations with the appropriate statements, and remove the EU emblem. Moving on to organic. Now, there's been a lot spoken about organic over the last year, and unfortunately, the situation hasn't changed. So from the 1st of January, UK organic goods can't be sold as organic in the EU. To clarify, the goods themselves can still be sold, you just can't describe them as organic. Now, goods sold in the EU as organic must have been produced in compliance with the EU rules on organic production, or with national third country rules that the EU recognises as equivalent to its own. Now, the UK rules on organic are identical to those of the EU, so we expect to be granted equivalency. But unfortunately, the EU won't consider that until we're treated as a third country on the 1st of January. When we talk about describing the goods as organic, what we mean are the words you use. So for example, organic in the title, references to organic methods in the description, and the logos that you use. So the EU or organic logos and any organic control body logo like the Soil Association. So to make your goods compliant for export to the EU after 1st of January, you're going to need to remove organic descriptions from the name of the food, both the front of pack and the rear of pack descriptive name. Remove any references to organic from the color text. Remove the organic control body logo. Remove the EU and the UK organic logo. And then finally, amend the origin statement. Now, one of the requirements for EU organic products is that they're labeled with their origin, which in most cases was EU. They'll need to be amended to either UK or non-EU, or removed entirely if that's a possibility for that product. So yeah, if you are amending an organic product, it will have an origin statement on there. Now, the one exception to describing as organic is describing individual ingredients as organic. Now, under the EU rules, goods that use organic ingredients can describe those ingredients as organic in the ingredient list, even if the product can't be described as organic. And we don't expect that to change. So from the 1st of January, the relationship between UK-based test houses and the EU is going to change, and I wanted to explain how this might affect you. To briefly explain, UCAS is our national body. It assesses whether test houses are competent to test goods for compliance against EU legislation. Now, any test house which is deemed competent is given notified body status. They can assess goods for compliance against the EU requirements and issue test certificates that are accepted across the EU. Now, from 1st of January UK, notified body accreditation will no longer be recognised in Europe. So UK test houses won't be able to certify that UK goods comply with EU laws that insist on mandatory testing or examination. Now, that won't directly affect you because EU food legislation doesn't normally specify mandatory testing against harmonised standards in the legislation. Nevertheless, you might find that trading partners in the EU insist that any testing you do on their goods is conducted by an EU-approved test house. It's something that you need to discuss with them, and I'd encourage you to do it at the earliest opportunity. You may also find that EU enforcement agencies suspecting non-compliance on technical grounds, so levels of pesticide residues, for example, might not consider your testing to be valid unless it's been conducted by an EU-approved test house. Now, if your test house is established and certified in both the UK and the EU, it will still be able to certify the compliance of goods against EU requirements after the 1st of January. But the testing will have to be carried out by the EU-based lab. So again, you should contact your test house and discuss this at the earliest opportunity. Now, I'd like to move on to something called mutual recognition, which I suspect most people would not have heard of, but it is pretty important. Now, the principle of mutual recognition tells us that any product that isn't covered by harmonised laws that can legally be sold in one member state can be legally sold in all other member states, even if it doesn't comply with the local laws in those member states. Now, when we talk about EU harmonisation, we mean the product is subject to laws that establish the rules for that product, which are then applied in the same way across all EU member states. Mutual recognition doesn't normally apply for food because it only relates to non-harmonised laws, while food laws are usually harmonised. However, mutual recognition is more accurately described as applying to goods not subject to full EU harmonisation, and there are many foods that have rules that are not fully harmonised. These are all covered by mutual recognition. Now, most EU food laws come from regulations. That's legislation containing the chapter and verse rules, and all the member state does is pass a law to say it's an offence if you don't comply with it. Now, those laws are fully harmonised. Some food laws come from EU directives, and when we find laws that aren't fully harmonised, it's directives they tend to come from. Now, directives give you the general rules that need to be followed, but each member state then passes their own legislation with the specifics in it that apply in that member state only. And they'll often take the opportunity to put in rules that were not in the directive. This means that most member states have got details in their food laws that are different to other member states. I'll give you an example of this. The Cocoa and Chocolate Product Regs is a UK law that enacts the EU Cocoa Directive in the UK. All the detail is found in that UK legislation. The UK law tells us that chocolate made with milk replacement products can be described as milk chocolate, despite not containing any milk. Now, other member states don't include that provision, so their local businesses can't describe dairy-free products in the same way. Now, despite not complying with the local law, UK products described in this way can be sold in all other member states because mutual recognition applies and effectively makes it legal. Now, we've had the situation in Kent where a client supplying these goods were held by the German authorities until we contacted them directly, explained that mutual recognition applied, and they were then released onto the market. Now, unfortunately, mutual recognition will not apply to the UK after the 1st of January. Any UK product that relies on mutual recognition to be traded legally in the EU will likely be refused entry to the EU from day one. So any UK product previously relying on mutual recognition will need to comply with the law of the member state in which it is first placed on the community market. Now, in the example we've discussed, the product can't be legally sold in the EU after 1st of January. Unfortunately, the specific rules are likely to change from one member state to another, so you'll need to take advice on the legal requirements in each destination country. This is a list of foods that are covered by laws passed by Directive, and as I say, as a general rule, they tend to be the ones where we find differences between member states. Now, it's unlikely you're going to be able to identify whether you're relying on mutual recognition to trade your goods unless you have an in-depth understanding of the legislation. So you might want to take advice from trading standards, or even better, the enforcement agency in the destination member state, as they're the ones who are going to know their laws best. Now, the last thing I wanted to cover was food that's already been placed on the market. And the reason being is that the EU have told us that any goods legally placed on the market before 1st of January can continue to be sold through until that stock is exhausted. Now, food placed on the market is defined in legislation as either held in the EU for the purposes of sale in all its various forms, or food sold, distributed, or transferred to the EU 27. So in practice, this means that the food has either been sold or distributed to, or is physically located in the EU before 1st of January. Now, the EU's made it clear that this provision relates to individual items rather than product lines. Therefore, it's only the physical product that can be sold through, i.e. The 1,000 can of beans in the EU, rather than all stock of those beans that are being produced. Now, if you aren't going to be able to rework the product prior to the deadline, you might want to consider physically moving it into the EU so you can use the sell-through provision. So that's it. Thank you very much for listening. And of course, I'll be happy to answer any questions. Okay.
Thank you, Nathan. That was it was great. I'm just going to have a quick check in the chat to see what questions we've had through. I'm going to just ask Richard to do his piece next before we take any of those questions, and then we'll follow all the questions after that, because it may be that they get added to or answered by things that are about to be said. So could I hand over now to Richard Bond from the DIT?
Okay, thank you, Jill. As Jill said, I'm from the Department for International Trade. I'm a trade advisor. I'm not an expert on some of the issues that I'm going to talk about, but I just want to give you the basic principles. And if people have got questions and I don't know the answer, I can certainly give directional guidance as to where the answers might be found. Though, like a lot of what Nathan said, some of the evolution of the rules is becoming clearer and may indeed become even clearer if some sort of white smoke or black smoke emerges from the Brexit talks. So at the moment, there are a few things that might emerge from the latest discussions, but most of what I'm talking about has been in place for some time. And I think my main message is you need to get your thinking caps on and see what things are going to affect you. So what I'll be talking about basically is, and I haven't got a presentation, I'm afraid, but I'll talk about just a few very simple themes. I'm going to talk about the logistics and the barriers in terms of the process of moving product into the EU 27 from January the 1st. And duties and taxes, as I say, we understand the rules around VAT today, but some of the duty issues may become clearer in the next week or two. But I'm assuming that there may be duties on some of the products that you export. So if we start with where we are today, I mean, the reason that this is such a big issue for almost all companies is that exporting to the EU today is really easy. You literally just need to put your products on a truck and give the forwarder or the trucker some information, attach a commercial invoice, and the product is in free circulation already within the EU and moves to the point of destination. And with e-commerce, products are moving from a retailer under what are called distance selling rules. And again, assuming that you're under the distance selling thresholds in terms of VAT, for example, you're moving product relatively freely. Now, sadly, all of that is going to change as we become a third country. And we will basically have to treat any exports from the UK going to the EU as we would shipping to America, Canada, Japan, Africa, anywhere that's outside the EU. And what I'll do is I'll run through the 2 or 3 things that will be barriers to export and give you some areas that need thinking about. So in terms of just the first bite-sized bit of advice is, at the moment, I would guess that many of you deliver to your clients in Europe. That means that you are effectively delivering with the duty and VAT paid. So the customer just gets your product and unloads it and happily, having paid you, happily consumes the product. Now, in future, you're going to need to agree with your client what your terms of trade are. So there's a set of terms called Incoterms, which are really important. If you look them up online, there are some really useful guides, because Incoterms define the responsibilities between the seller in the UK and the buyer in Europe. And they can vary from Ex Works, which means that your client comes to your factory, picks up the goods. Now, technically, you don't even have to forklift them onto the truck. You just need to make them available for export. But I guess in most cases, you would put them on their truck and off they go. You have no responsibilities in terms of the paperwork now or in the future. The only issue for you with Ex Works is that you will have to prove export. Otherwise, HMRC will be coming to you for the VAT, assuming you've exported them without VAT, as you would have to do in 2021. So the first thing to decide is whether your Incoterms are leaving the responsibility to your client, or whether you want to take the full responsibility, as many of you would do today, and move to a delivery status called DDP, delivered duty paid. Now, the implications are quite enormous, because not only will you have to do the export declaration, if you're DDP, this is, if you're delivering, you'll have to pay your freight forwarder to do an export declaration. They will move them into the country of destination, maybe through France, as Nathan alluded to, but they will go to your destination, let's say Germany, and at that point, there will have to be an importer of record. Now, if that importer of record, you want to be that importer of record, and you arrange that through your freight forwarder to basically allow you to complete the paperwork for import, pay the customs duty if there is any, and the key question is import VAT. So if you're the importer of record and you're delivering duty paid, you are responsible for the VAT, for example, in Germany. Now, that would mean registering for VAT in Germany and recording and adhering to all the regulatory requirements of handling VAT. It might, in 19 of the 27 EU countries, you would also have to appoint a fiscal representative if you want VAT, if you want to pay VAT, because the local VAT authorities do not recognize third countries, such as the UK, as being trustworthy enough to have a VAT account and therefore a liability for VAT. So you have to appoint a fiscal representative. Again, this is more money, more complexity. They would have to put up guarantees for perhaps about half the VAT. So those three steps of exporting it, importing it, and handling the VAT liability are new in terms of dealing with the EU clients, and they're all quite onerous. And I can imagine in particular for people who are doing mail order, for example, or e-commerce, that you have a serious decision to make as to whether you're going to ship and alert the client to the fact that they will have to pay the necessary duties and taxes on the arrival of your product, or whether you will take that responsibility and deliver to them with duty, potentially duty, and VAT paid. Although, as I understand it, anything under 150 euros is not going to be dutiable. So if they're small value items, they will at least move through without duty, but you still will have the issue of VAT, which is different, incidentally, in every European country. So what I'm strongly suggesting is that you've got some pretty important decisions to make in terms of actually deciding what your terms of trade are and how you will talk to your customer or customers in terms of what are your responsibilities and what are their responsibilities. And if you want to move to, as many companies are doing, to take away as little of the to give the customer in Europe as little of the problem as you can, in other words, to change as little as possible, then you will have to move to handling VAT and potentially clearing product into a country in Europe, which is not necessarily easy. Now, there are a number of ways of doing it, which might involve getting third parties and fiscal representatives and actually appointing people to handle these things on your behalf. But I think it's pretty important that people talk to their customers, particularly if you're shipping to, say, a distributor or a major customer, have that discussion with them and understand what they are prepared to do. They may want to negotiate a price reduction or different terms with you, but be prepared to act as the importer of record and to pay VAT locally, because they'll be geared up to do that. But I think that that's a discussion that you would need to have, and I'm advising clients to get that on the table pretty quickly, because that is a major difference. If you're sending stuff from your website on e-commerce, again, you're going to have to be clear. You're either going to take the responsibility of delivering to the client as you do today, which will mean some quite onerous commitments, or you'll have to decide that you won't be dealing with those clients and find some way of blocking them from actually ordering on your site. Or you could have a very clear set of communications which say, we're going to do this and we need you to do that. So if, for example, you decided you would send product, mail order product, let's say, to Europe, then you will have to do a number of things in this country to complete some customs forms. And the suggestions are, you've got a customs declaration, which you can get from a post office, And there are two forms. One is under £270, one is over. You would need to have a commercial invoice. And the suggestion again is to put that on the outside of the pack so that the customs, because they will be customs checked now, which they're not today, the form should be stuck to the outside, as we're all used to when parcels arrive with the paperwork on the outside. And on that paperwork, the commercial invoice, you should write your HS code, how your products are categorized, because that is the basis on which customs in Europe will decide whether duties are applicable. And you will also need to write the country of origin. So as Nathan touched on, origin is quite an important thing. So you would need to put the country of origin of the products, because again, that might affect the rate of duty applicable. There are lots of other steps and questions, and I guess all I'm trying to do is alert you to the major questions which are significant. There is plenty of advice available online, although I have to admit the .gov.uk websites are not very clear in many cases. But there are people who will help you to think about how you make an export declaration, normally a freight forwarder, or I know that Kent Invicta Chamber will do those customs declarations for you, but there will be information that they will need from you because they will be making that application on your behalf and you are legally responsible for the information. It might be things such as value, harmonized system code, VAT numbers, etc., etc. So it's well worth talking to a freight forwarder and understanding from them what they will need from you after January the 1st. As Nathan touched on, a number of companies are deciding also as part of their discussions with their clients to perhaps move some buffer stock into Europe before January the 1st to give themselves a little bit of time to organize whatever they need to organize, be it VAT registration or getting a warehouse for distribution. You know, Amazon, for example, have withdrawn the ability to deliver to the UK for European fulfillment, but it is still possible for you to ship to a country and then fulfill through the Amazon in that Amazon company in that country. But it would be, again, necessary to register for VAT and handle the VAT in an official way with that particular country. So I'm at risk of making things more complicated with every sentence that I utter. So I will try and step back and answer questions as you have them. But one of the things I and my colleagues in Kent, we've got Hazel O'Boyle and Kate Pinkerton, who are also trade advisors who might be known to many of you. And I would suggest that you ask your questions of them and they will then be able to provide you with the best information that we have today. It's not always perfect, it's not always clear, and it's certainly going to require more effort from a lot of companies, and that might inform your decision to deal with that market or not deal with that market, but it's best to have that thought process up front now before we get to that point.
Thanks, Richard.
Okay, Jill, that's my 10 minutes of waffle as requested.
Thanks, Richard. I'm sure that's been really useful. I am aware that one or two people need to exit the call at 2 because they've got other commitments. So I'm going to dive straight into questions if that's okay. The first one that came up on the chat today is really around labelling. So for Nathan, regarding the phrases gluten-free and vegan on a beer product, what is the situation? Can they still say gluten-free? Is there some sort of standard or certification that would be required?
There has been a lot of discussion about whether vegan will get a legal definition. No legislation has been passed at the moment. With regards to gluten, the rules will be staying exactly the same, so continue doing what you are currently doing.
Great, that's a really simple one. And on a similar vein, this is another one on beer for you, Richard. Beer duty, they currently send beer duty suspended on FCA terms with customer collecting. They believe they can still use EMCS for the UK element, but will I still need to produce a customs deck for the freight forwarder and EU customer?
Hello, Ginny. Yes, is the answer. FCA means free carrier, and it's normally FCA with a location, but you will need, depends on the location, I suppose. If it's FCA your warehouse, which you weren't clear about, if it's your warehouse, you would just have to provide the information to the forwarder, because the client would be responsible for, or the client's forwarder who picks up from your warehouse would be responsible for the export declaration. But remember what I said about Ex Works. You just need to make sure that you have some way of getting that proof of export to avoid any potential HMRC issues. So I think the answer is you would still have to give information to the forwarder. Whether they do the declaration or not depends on what your FCA place is.
The FCA is the brewery in Tenterden.
Okay, in which case your responsibilities end once the products leave your warehouse. But the implication of FCA is that you're responsible for the declaration. I think you'll find that. So the difference between Ex Works is that you have no responsibility. Free carrier means you provided all the information up to the carrier putting their documentation in. So you'll have to provide the information for the customs deck.
Thanks, Richard. So I'm going to go back to Nathan with another labelling question. When it comes to labelling with a relevant EU address, is over-labelling / an additional label added onto the pack permitted, or does it need to be printed on the pack / label itself?
Over-labelling is perfectly fine, providing the correct information is on there and the label doesn't obliterate any other mandatory labelling. Okay, so just be careful about how you over-sticker it. Your address details can be on there as the manufacturer. So if you want to, you can put an additional label which doesn't cover up your details, which has the EU importer's details on. So either one is okay.
Thank you, Nathan. And I'm going to go to now some of the pre-asked questions from people who submitted questions ahead of the event. So I think the first one we've probably covered, Richard, which was how will the new legislation affect mail order to the EU?
Yes, I mean, I think, as I said, the most important thing in terms of mail order to the EU is that you will be responsible. Sorry, you will have to treat the EU as if it's a third country. So you will now have to fill in customs declarations and attach the invoices, as I suggested, to the outside of the parcel. And also, you'll have to be clear to your customer if you're not going to pay the duties and taxes in the European country, then you have to communicate that that's what you're not going to do that. I suspect in most cases, companies will not want to pay the, sorry, I've muted myself. I suggest that in most cases, the companies will not want to pay the duties and taxes in the EU. In many cases, the only other option is to move stock into the EU and then distribute it from there. And in that way, you would import your product into the EU in one place and register for VAT only in that place, and then distribute from there under the distance selling threshold. So effectively, you move your UK operation to a warehouse in Holland, for example, from where you distribute any orders from Europe. I guess it will depend on the scale of the operation. For occasional shipments, you've got two choices really. One is you make it clear to the client that they're going to pay taxes and VAT, and you do all the paperwork to get it to them. Or the other option is that you just drop out of European European mail order. I mean, in many cases, I think people would be quite used to importing parcels from outside of the EU and getting a DHL requirement to pay some money. But I think you'd have to be very, very clear up front with your clients what your terms are in order to avoid returns from people who weren't expecting any charges. So that would be my advice: is you can just follow the model which people have used for, you know, shipping product outside of Europe in the past.
Thank you, Richard. That was great. And another question that we had before the event. I'm not sure this is a one for either of you, but I'm hoping one of you is going to put your hand up. Is there any financial support to businesses regarding EC approval numbers being changed to UK approval numbers?
Approval for what?
Nathan's got his hand up.
All I can say is EC approval numbers. That's relating to hygiene. So unfortunately, it's going to be environmental health that have to advise on that, simply because it's not within our area of expertise. And I would recommend that people follow the link that you've put in the chat earlier on, which is to the Growth Hub, because I know Growth Hub are advising people on access to funding to deal with Brexit.
Brilliant, thank you, Nathan. And again, I'm not sure if the person who asked the following question is on the call, but just in case, what are the new rules with regard to exporting rum?
Okay. I'll just cover the rum bit and then I'll pass it over to Richard for the export part. The rules are changing for spirit drinks, but they're not changing until May 2021. So if you do need advice on the new requirements for spirit drinks, get in touch with Trading Standards. But otherwise, all the things I covered with regards to food legislation would apply to rum. Oh, that's my doorbell going. And I'll pass it over to Richard to talk about export.
Okay. Again, I would say that the rules for exporting alcohol, it's a very controlled process. And I would say that actually, you know, things like the duty drawback system, where goods are not consumed in the UK, or the rules for removal of goods from excise warehouses, will all remain the same. So I would suggest that the only additional controls, if you like, are more in the paperwork and logistics area, rather than in the relationship with HMRC in terms of movement of excise goods, because those controls have been in place for many years. So in that case, I would suggest there's not going to be that much difference, other than in the sort of paperwork you'll see.
Great, thanks, Richard. And the last question that we had submitted before the event was quite specific. It regards importing ready incubated mushroom blocks from France and how they are likely to be affected.
Richard, do you have any knowledge on the import side of things?
Okay, I can give you a principle, which is that for imports, the government, in terms of duties and taxes, and I'm thinking VAT, has been much more lenient than we're expecting for exports to the EU. And what I mean by that is that in terms of movements into the UK, and I can't comment on the regulatory aspects, but in terms of the money that changes hands, if there are any duties applied on mushrooms, then you will have 6 months, basically from January to July, to make declarations. You will have to record the arrival, but you'll actually have a period of grace to actually pay money, pay duty. And the same with VAT. There'll be a deferment system in place, postponed VAT accounting for imports. So I suspect that the government has also simplified the duty rates. So they've taken a lot of where duties were under 2%, they've been eliminated largely. And they've tried to simplify, you know, if the duty was 1.7, they've reduced it to 1. So there've been some changes to simplify, basically because we rely on a lot of product coming in from the EU. So hopefully, if you look at the UK global tariff, and there will be enough information, if you know the code of the product you import, look at that, and it will tell you the duty rates and the you know, the issues in terms of regulation, tax, duty, and that should give you a signpost. But as a principle, it should be simpler, and there's a period of grace in the first part of the year to stop Dover becoming clogged. They've simplified procedures for importation. But I don't know the specifics in answer to your...
Sorry, I have also just added in the link the .gov trade tariff link.
Okay.
So if people do need to check the implications for their individual products, they can take it from there.
Just a very quick addition to that one. I know that it's for mushrooms that can be cultivated in the UK. Now, it's possible that anything which is brought in to cultivate is going to be listed, can be considered high risk. So I would recommend that the person who asked that question goes to the HMRC advice line and gives them a call, because I think that will probably be a more complicated product because of its nature.
Okay, excellent advice. Just a follow-up question on the EC health mark, which perhaps you can help with. Will they still be allowed to use packaging that carries the EC health mark on or after the 1st of Jan?
I would say, again, I would caveat this to say it's hygiene legislation, which I don't work with, and it is environmental health that will have to be giving you formal advice. They can be contacted through your local council. But my understanding is that the EC health marks are being replaced with UK health marks. Again, that's my understanding. But as Richard alluded to, and as a lot of the legislation says, if it's coming in, you'll be given that leeway up until July. So it's less of an issue if it's coming in. If you're talking about the health mark that you apply going out, then yeah, that'll apply from the 1st of January, and you should take advice from Environment and Health as soon as you can.
Thanks, Nathan. Does anybody else have any further questions? I'm just checking back through the chat to see if I've missed anyone. So please let me know if I have not asked your question to our speakers today. And one more question coming in now.
A use of current packaging within
the UK
market. Okay. The UK have said that they're going to be lenient. They've instructed enforcement bodies to be lenient for the first 6 months until July. But again, you'll need to get that official from Environmental Health. Yeah. And while there are no questions, I just want to reiterate something I said on the last one to sort of bring it home to people. I was present on a recent HMRC sort of training session, and something they said which really brought it home to me is they regurgitated the figures about 50% of UK businesses not making any preparations. We all know that. However, what I didn't realise is that Europe are in exactly the same position. Their figures showed that 50% of all EU businesses had made no preparations for Brexit, and only 10% consider themselves to be Brexit ready. So the message here is you can't rely on your counterpart in Europe to be able to get it right for you. Odds are they don't know either, so you have to take responsibility for getting it right.
Jill, can I just add as well, if you are moving product into Europe, make sure your freight forwarder is on the ball as well. because some freight forwarders are better than others. And now is probably the time to have a conversation with a freight forwarder and just make sure that if you need, as Ginny said, you know, if you need to do documentation, that you're clear with them what they need to complete the documentation. Quite a lot of people now are issuing things called direct representation paperwork, which is where you put down the information that your freight and send it to your freight forwarder on a form, because they are taking responsibility for completing that information for HMRC's system to export the product. So people are becoming a bit more formal in many cases. But talk to your forwarder, talk to Kent Invicta Chamber, the documentation team, because they're the people who will have much more detailed knowledge of the sort of paperwork you need to complete.
Thank you, Richard. I was just going to say we have dropped the contact details in at the bottom of the chat now, so hopefully those who couldn't see them before can actually see them and can take the details they want from there. You can use the Medway Growth Hub also to get a link through to the chamber from there as well. If there are no further questions, then I would just like to thank everybody for coming along. We have recorded the session today, and so it will be available to play back and listen again if there is any detail that people have missed and want to double check. And you have our contact details if you would like to contact us with any questions afterwards. Okay, so if there is nothing further from anybody, then we will sign off today. And there are a series of trading standards talks coming up. Please do look out for the links over the next few weeks, covering a range of topics. The dates will be being published very, very shortly, and we will be sharing them produced in Kent on our social media, as will the KCC Trading Standards Business social media and other methods. So do look out for those, because there may be more information that is pertinent to your business coming up in those workshops. Other than that, thank you very much and good afternoon.